Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Imagine everything you thought you knew about Abraham Lincoln was only half the story. Was he truly the saintly leader who preserved the Union and ended slavery out of pure moral conviction, or was he a shrewd politician, navigating treacherous waters with compromises, contradictions, and cold calculations? The image of Lincoln we see today is larger than life, a man of unwavering virtue, honesty, and courage. But history is rarely so simple. What if Lincoln's views on slavery were more pragmatic than principled? What if his leadership during the Civil War involved controversial decisions that tested the limits of democracy? Picture this: Lincoln standing on the battlefield at Gettysburg delivering a speech that would echo through the centuries, the Civil War raging around him, brother fighting brother, the future of the nation hanging in the balance. Then, flash. Forward to that fateful night at Ford's Theater. A single gunshot ending the life of one of the most significant figures in American history. But between these defining moments lies a story often left untold. Lincoln's use of wartime powers stretched constitutional boundaries, suspending habeas corpus, silencing dissent, even approving controversial military strategies that cost thousands of lives. He was a man shaped by the brutal realities of politics, forced to make decisions that were not always guided by idealism, but by necessity. So who is the real Lincoln? A moral visionary ahead of his time, or a pragmatic leader making impossible choices? The answer is more complex than the history books often tell us. Stick with us as we dive deep into the untold story of Abraham Lincoln, revealing the man behind the myth. Abraham Lincoln's journey begins in the rugged frontier of early 19th century America, in a small one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, on February 12, 1809. The world he was born into was one of hardship, relentless labor, and few opportunities. His parents, Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, were farmers, struggling to carve out a living from the unforgiving wilderness. Life on the Chi. Frontier was brutal, disease was rampant, education was a luxury, and survival depended on sheer determination. Lincoln's father, Thomas, was a firm but uneducated man who believed in hard work and self-reliance. He moved the family to Indiana when Abraham was just 7, seeking better land and escaping the legal disputes over property in Kentucky. But tragedy struck when young Abraham was only 9 years old. His mother, Nancy, died of milk sickness, a deadly illness caused by drinking contaminated milk from cows that had fed on poisonous plants. Her death left a deep emotional scar on the boy, shaping his sense of loss and resilience. His father quickly remarried a woman named Sarah Bush Johnston, who became a loving stepmother, encouraging Lincoln's thirst for knowledge. Unlike many children of his time, Lincoln was not content with a life of farming and manual labor. He had almost no formal education, perhaps a year's worth in total, but he was fiercely determined to learn. He read voraciously, often borrowing books from neighbors, walking miles just to get his hands on volumes like The Life of George Washington and Aesop's Fables. By candlelight, he would study, writing out passages in the dirt or on wooden planks before scraping them clean to use again. This hunger for knowledge set him apart in a world where most people had little time or inclination for intellectual pursuits. But growing up in the backwoods of Indiana and later Illinois, Lincoln also witnessed the darker realities of American life. While his family was not wealthy enough to own slaves, slavery was an institution he encountered firsthand. As a young man, Lincoln took a flatboat trip down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, where he saw the horrors of human bondage up close. He visited bustling slave markets where men, women, and children were bought and sold like livestock. The sight of families being torn apart, of human beings treated as property, left a lasting impression on him. He later described these experiences as moments that shaped his views on slavery, planting the seeds of moral opposition that would define his political career. However, Lincoln's early views on slavery were complex. While he found the practice morally repugnant, he did not always advocate for immediate abolition. Like many of his time, he wrestled with questions of race, economic realities, and political feasibility. But the young boy who once gazed upon the cruelty of slavery in New Orleans would one day be the man to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln's early years were marked by relentless struggle, loss, and self-made education. From the fields of Indiana to the streets of New Orleans, his journey would take him far beyond the humble log cabin of his birth. These experiences shaped him into the man who would one day lead the nation through its darkest hour. Abraham Lincoln's rise from a self-educated frontier boy to one of America's most influential political figures was anything but conventional. Without formal schooling, wealthy connections, or family influence, he relied solely on his intellect, relentless work ethic, and an unshakable ambition to make something of himself. After leaving his father's farm as a young man, Lincoln worked a variety of jobs: store clerk, surveyor, postmaster, but it was the law that ultimately captured his interest. Without attending a single day of law school, he taught himself legal principles by reading Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England and other legal texts. He often borrowed books, studied them by firelight, and relentlessly questioned experienced lawyers. He absorbed legal arguments, case precedents, and courtroom strategies, turning himself into a formidable legal mind through sheer determination. By 1836, after years of independent study, Lincoln passed the bar exam and became a practicing lawyer in Illinois. He built a reputation as a skilled, honest attorney, earning the nickname Honest Abe. His approach in court was simple but effective. He relied on plain-spoken language, logic, and storytelling to connect with juries. Unlike many lawyers of his time who relied on complex legal jargon, Lincoln had a gift for making the law understandable to ordinary people. He handled a wide variety of cases, from land disputes to criminal defense, often traveling from town to town as part of the 8th Judicial Circuit, a grueling journey that saw him ride hundreds of miles across the state. But law was only a stepping stone. Lincoln had greater ambitions. In 1834, he won a seat in the Illinois state legislature as a member of the Whig Party. During these early years, his political views on slavery began to take shape. While he opposed its expansion into new territories, he did not yet advocate for outright abolition. Like many moderate politicians of the time, he believed slavery was morally wrong, but struggled with how to end it without destabilizing the nation. His early political career was marked by a series of defeats and setbacks. He served 4 terms in the state legislature and 1 term in Congress. But after failing to secure a government appointment, he temporarily stepped away from politics to focus on his legal career. However, the growing national debate over slavery would soon draw him back into the political arena, setting the stage for one of the most defining moments of his career. By the 1850s, the issue of slavery had reached a boiling point in America. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, reignited fierce national debates. Outraged by the prospect of slavery expanding into new regions, Lincoln re-entered politics and became a leading voice against its spread. His defining moment came in 1858 when he ran for the U.S. Senate against Stephen A. Douglas, the dominant political figure in Illinois. Their series of debates, known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates, catapulted Lincoln onto the national stage. These 7 debates, held across Illinois, focused primarily on the issue of slavery and its expansion. Douglas, a supporter of popular sovereignty, argued that individual states and territories should decide for themselves. Lincoln, on the other hand, took a firm stance, arguing that slavery was a moral wrong and should not be allowed to expand. It was during these debates that Lincoln delivered one of his most famous lines: "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He warned that America could not endure permanently half slave and half free. While Lincoln lost the Senate race to Douglas, his passionate arguments and clear stance on slavery gained him national recognition. The debates cemented his reputation as a rising political force. His ability to articulate complex moral and political issues in a way that resonated with ordinary Americans made him an appealing figure. Just 2 years later, in 1860, Lincoln's growing popularity would propel him to an even greater challenge: the race for the presidency. His journey from a self-taught lawyer to a national political leader was a testament to his resilience and intellect. He was not born into power, nor was his path to success easy. Every victory was hard-won, every setback a lesson that prepared him for the monumental challenges ahead. The stage was set for Lincoln to become a leader unlike any America had ever seen. By 1860, the United States stood at a breaking point. Decades of conflict over slavery, state rights, and economic divisions had left the country deeply fractured. As the presidential election approached, tensions reached a fever pitch. Abraham Lincoln, a relatively unknown Illinois politician just a few years prior, found himself at the center of the storm. His election would spark an unprecedented crisis, the secession of the Southern states and the formation of the Confederacy. Lincoln's path to the presidency was far from typical. He was not the most experienced candidate, nor was he the most widely recognized political figure in the country. However, his strong stance against the expansion of slavery and his reputation for honesty and integrity made him a compelling choice for the newly formed Republican Party. The party itself was a coalition of former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, and abolitionists, all united by the goal of stopping slavery's spread into new territories. The election of 1860 was one of the most chaotic and divided in American history. 4 major candidates vied for the presidency, each representing vastly different visions for the nation. Lincoln, the Republican nominee, faced off against Northern Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, and Constitutional Union candidate John Bell. The country was effectively split in two, with Northern states supporting Lincoln or Douglas, while Southern states overwhelmingly backed Breckinridge, who was pro-slavery. In a testament to how deeply divided the nation had become, Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot in 10 Southern states. Many in the South already viewed him as a direct threat to their way of life, despite the fact that he had repeatedly stated he had no intention of abolishing slavery where it already existed. Instead, his position was to prevent its expansion, stance that Southern leaders saw as the first step toward eventual abolition. Despite this regional polarization, Lincoln won the election with only 39.8% of the popular vote. His victory was entirely due to the support of the North, where he carried nearly every free state. The Electoral College told an even more striking story. Lincoln secured 180 electoral votes, far more than the 152 needed to win. However, the South saw his election as nothing short of a declaration of war on their economic and social system. The reaction was immediate. Before Lincoln had even taken office, Southern states began seceding from the Union. South Carolina was the first to act, declaring its secession on December 20, 1860. In the following weeks, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed. By February 1861, these states had banded together to form the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln, still president-elect at the time, watched as the nation unraveled before he had the chance to take office. He was walking into an unprecedented crisis, one that no president had ever faced before. Some advised him to negotiate with the South, to offer further compromises to appease the seceding states. But Lincoln firmly believed that secession was illegal and that the Union was perpetual. It could not be dissolved by any state or group of states. As he prepared for his inauguration in March 1861, Lincoln carefully crafted his first major speech as president. His inaugural address was a plea for unity. He reassured the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed, stating, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." But he also made it clear that secession was unacceptable. The union of these states is perpetual. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. Despite his appeals, the South was unmoved. In their eyes, Lincoln's election alone was proof that the federal government could no longer be trusted to protect their way of life. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the nation. In the weeks following his inauguration, Lincoln desperately tried to keep the Union intact through diplomatic measures. But tensions escalated further in April 1861 when Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina, marking the beginning of the Civil War. The time for negotiation was over. More Southern states, including Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, joined the Confederacy, and Lincoln was left with an impossible task, preserving the Union in the face of its greatest existential threat. The election of 1860 had not just decided a president. It had shattered the fragile balance that had held the country together for decades. Lincoln had won the presidency without winning a single Southern state, a stark illustration of just how divided America had become. Now, with the country on the brink of war, he would be forced to lead a fractured nation through its darkest hour. As Abraham Lincoln took office in March 1861, the United States was already unraveling. 11 Southern states had declared their secession, forming the Confederate States of America, and just weeks into his presidency, the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter. Lincoln, a man with no formal military training, was now responsible for leading the Union through the most devastating conflict in American history. His leadership would be tested like never before, and every decision he made would determine whether the nation could survive. Leading a fractured nation, Lincoln understood from the outset that the war was not just about battlefields. It was a struggle for the very soul of the nation. His primary goal was preserving the Union, not necessarily ending slavery. He famously wrote in a letter to journalist Horace Greeley, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." This statement revealed Lincoln's pragmatic approach to leadership. While he personally found slavery morally repugnant, he knew that his first duty was to keep the Union intact. He needed to maintain support from the border states, slave states like Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland that had not joined the Confederacy, but were on the brink. If they seceded, the Union's chances of victory would shrink dramatically. At the same time, Lincoln faced the immense challenge of managing a war that was far more brutal and drawn out than many had anticipated. The Union suffered humiliating defeats early on, such as the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. Lincoln was forced to build and maintain public confidence while also managing a deeply divided government. Some in the North wanted a swift and total war against the South, while others pushed for peace talks. Lincoln had to navigate these competing factions while also ensuring that the Union had a coherent military strategy. The Emancipation Proclamation: morality or strategy? By mid-1862, Lincoln began to shift his approach. The war was dragging on, and Union victories were scarce. He realized that simply preserving the Union was not enough. He needed to weaken the Confederacy's war effort, and slavery was its backbone. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, was one of Lincoln's most consequential decisions. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate states shall be thenceforward, and forever free. However, it did not immediately free any slaves in Union-held slave states or areas under Union control. This was not just a moral decision. It was a calculated military move. By making the war about slavery, Lincoln effectively ensured that European powers, particularly Britain and France, would not recognize or aid the Confederacy. Both nations had already abolished slavery and would not support a government fighting to preserve it. The proclamation also encouraged enslaved people in the South to flee or resist, further weakening the Confederate economy and war effort. Still, the Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point. Though it did not end slavery outright, that would come with the 13th Amendment in 1865, it reshaped the war's purpose. No longer was the conflict just about preserving the Union. It was now a fight for freedom. The Gettysburg Address: redefining the nation. Perhaps no speech in American history carries as much weight as Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, delivered on November 19, 1863, at the dedication of the Gettysburg Battlefield Cemetery. The war had entered its third brutal year, with death tolls soaring into the hundreds of thousands. The Union had won a crucial victory at Gettysburg just months earlier, but the conflict was far from over. Lincoln's speech was remarkably brief, just 272 words, but in those few minutes he transformed the meaning of the war and the nation itself. He began by recalling the principles of the American Revolution. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He framed the war as not just a struggle to save the Union, but a test of whether a nation built on those ideals could endure. He honored the soldiers who had died at Gettysburg, but reminded his audience that it was up to the living to ensure their sacrifice was not in vain, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. With these words, Lincoln redefined the war as a fight not just for the survival of the United States, but for democracy itself. The speech was initially met with mixed reactions. Some thought it was too short and unimpressive, but over time, it became recognized as one of the most powerful speeches in history, capturing the essence of what America was fighting for. The struggle with his generals. While Lincoln's leadership on the political front was masterful, his military leadership was fraught with challenges, especially when it came to his generals. One of his greatest frustrations was General George McClellan, the commander of the Army of the Potomac. McClellan was an incredibly talented organizer and strategist, but he was overly cautious and reluctant to engage in battle. He constantly overestimated Confederate forces and hesitated to strike even when he had clear advantages. Lincoln grew increasingly frustrated with McClellan's inaction, famously remarking, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time." After McClellan failed to decisively defeat Confederate forces in the Peninsula Campaign and later at Antietam, Lincoln finally removed him from command. But his problems didn't end there. He cycled through several more generals, Ambrose Burnside, Joseph Hooker, and George Meade, each with their own flaws and failures. It wasn't until 1864 that Lincoln found the commander he needed, Ulysses S. Grant. Unlike his predecessors, Grant was aggressive, decisive, and unrelenting. He understood that to win the war, the Union had to wear down the Confederacy through total warfare. Under Grant's command, and with the brutal campaigns led by General William Tecumseh Sherman in the South, the Union finally gained the upper hand. A leader shaped by war. By 1865, the Union was on the verge of victory, but Lincoln had paid a heavy price. The war had aged him dramatically. Photographs from the beginning of his presidency to its end show a man who had endured unimaginable stress and sorrow. He had lost his beloved son Willie to illness in 1862, suffered relentless criticism, and carried the burden of sending hundreds of thousands of men to their deaths. Yet through it all, Lincoln remained steadfast in his belief that the Union must be preserved and that America could emerge from the war stronger than before. His leadership was not just about military victories, it was about reshaping the nation's identity. With the war nearing its end, Lincoln now turned his attention to the question of Reconstruction. How would the South be brought back into the Union? What rights would newly freed Black Americans have? These were questions that would define the next chapter of American history. But tragically, Lincoln would not live to see the answers. Abraham. Lincoln is often remembered as the towering, resolute figure who saved the Union and ended slavery. But behind the iconic image of a determined leader was a deeply complex and often tormented man, one who struggled with profound personal battles, endured devastating losses, and held views on race and abolition that evolved over time. To truly understand Lincoln, one must look beyond his public persona and into the deeply human aspects of his life. A mind haunted by melancholy. Lincoln's life was shaped by an ever-present darkness, what was then called melancholy, and what modern psychologists would likely diagnose as clinical depression. From a young age, he exhibited signs of deep emotional distress. He was known for long periods of intense sadness, self-doubt, and an almost obsessive contemplation of mortality. Friends and colleagues often noted his somber demeanor, and he himself acknowledged his struggles, once saying, "I am the most miserable man living." Lincoln's early experiences likely contributed to this emotional burden. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died when he was just 9 years old, leaving an indelible mark on his psyche. The death of his first love, Anne Rutledge, in 1835 from typhoid fever, sent him into a depression so severe that friends feared he might take his own life. Years later, in 1841, Lincoln suffered another major breakdown, reportedly so intense that his friends removed razors and sharp objects from his reach. Despite these struggles, Lincoln did not allow his melancholy to consume him. Instead, he found ways to manage his pain, through humor, storytelling, and an unshakable sense of purpose. His ability to laugh even in the darkest moments became one of his defining characteristics. He often used self-deprecating jokes and witty remarks to diffuse tension, both for himself and those around him. His law partner, William Herndon, once observed, "His melancholy dripped from him as he walked." Yet it was this very sensitivity and depth of emotion that allowed him to empathize so deeply with others, shaping his leadership and his ability to connect with the American people. Marriage to Mary Todd Lincoln, a tumultuous union. Lincoln's relationship with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, was equally complex. Mary was intelligent, politically astute, and ambitious, qualities that drew Lincoln to her, but also led to a volatile marriage. She came from a wealthy Kentucky family and was well educated, making her an unusual match for the self-taught, rough-edged Lincoln. Their courtship was rocky, marked by a broken engagement in 1841 before they eventually reconciled and married in 1842. Mary had a fiery temper and was known for her sharp tongue, while Lincoln was patient and reserved. Their differences often led to heated arguments, and Mary's frequent outbursts were well documented by those who knew them. At times, she belittled Lincoln in public, frustrated by his lack of social refinement. Yet despite their frequent conflicts, Lincoln remained deeply devoted to her. The Lincolns also endured immense personal tragedy together. Of their 4 sons, only one, Robert Todd Lincoln, survived to adulthood. Their son Eddie died at age 4, and another son, Willie, died in the White House in 1862 at just 11 years old. The loss devastated both parents, but while Lincoln buried himself in work to cope, Mary was overcome with grief. She reportedly held seances in an attempt to communicate with Willie's spirit and withdrew from public life. Mary's emotional instability worsened over time, and after Lincoln's assassination, she descended into severe mental distress. Their marriage had been fraught with challenges, but it was also built on a deep, if often strained, partnership. She believed in his greatness long before the nation did and supported his political career, even when others doubted him. Lincoln's evolving views on race and abolition. One of the most debated aspects of Lincoln's legacy is his stance on race. Was he a true abolitionist, or was he simply a pragmatist who acted when politically necessary? Early in his career, Lincoln's views on race were shaped by the society he lived in. Like many white Americans of his time, he initially did not advocate for full racial equality. In the 1858 debates with Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln stated, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." This statement is often cited to argue that Lincoln was not truly committed to racial justice. However, his position was more nuanced. While he may not have initially supported full equality, he was steadfast in his belief that slavery was morally and fundamentally wrong. He opposed its expansion into new territories, arguing that the country could not remain half slave and half free. Over time, Lincoln's views evolved. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, was a pivotal moment, but even then, it only freed slaves in Confederate-held territories. Some critics argue that this was a political move rather than a purely moral decision. However, by the end of the war, Lincoln had come to believe in full abolition and even advocated for limited black suffrage, a radical stance at the time. In his final public speech on April 11, 1865, just days before his assassination, Lincoln suggested that educated black men and black veterans should be granted the right to vote. John Wilkes Booth, who was in the audience, was so enraged by this statement that he vowed, "That means NN or citizenship. That is the last speech he will ever make." 3 days later, Booth assassinated Lincoln at Ford's Theater, a man of contradictions and complexity. Lincoln was not a perfect man, nor was he a flawless leader. He struggled with his own emotions, made political calculations that sometimes prioritized pragmatism over ideology, and wrestled with the limitations of his time. Yet, despite these complexities, he was a man who grew, who listened, and who ultimately reshaped the nation. His ability to evolve, to endure immense suffering, and to remain steadfast in his mission to preserve the Union is what sets him apart. He was not just the solemn figure carved into Mount Rushmore or the saintly martyr of American history textbooks. He was a man, deeply flawed, deeply burdened, but also deeply committed to a vision of a better United States. By April 1865, the Civil War was drawing to a close. The Confederate capital of Richmond had fallen, and General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. The war had claimed over 600,000 lives, but at long last, the Union had been preserved. For Abraham Lincoln, the moment was bittersweet. He had endured 4 years of unimaginable hardship, yet now, just as victory was at hand, he faced the daunting challenge of reuniting a fractured nation. A vision for Reconstruction, Lincoln knew that winning the war was only the first step. The real challenge lay ahead: how to rebuild the South and integrate newly freed African Americans into American society. He had already begun laying the groundwork for Reconstruction, emphasizing a policy of leniency rather than punishment. His approach, known as the 10% Plan, proposed that Southern states could rejoin the Union once 10% of their voters pledged allegiance to the U.S. and accepted the end of slavery. This stance put him at odds with many in his own party. Radical Republicans in Congress, such as Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, wanted a harsher approach. They sought to dismantle the Southern power structure, redistribute land, and ensure full civil rights for freed African Americans. Lincoln, however, prioritized healing over retribution. He famously stated in his second inaugural address just a month earlier, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." His moderate approach angered many, including Confederate sympathizers who saw him as the man who had destroyed their way of life. Among them was a 26-year-old actor and fervent Confederate supporter named John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth. The assassin's plot. Booth was already a well-known figure in America. A popular stage actor, he came from a famous theatrical family and had performed in major cities across the country. But behind the scenes, Booth was consumed by rage. He despised Lincoln, blaming him for the war and the destruction of the South. In late 1864, Booth had begun plotting to kidnap Lincoln and hold him hostage in exchange for Confederate prisoners. But after the fall of Richmond and Lee's surrender, he realized that the Confederacy was beyond saving. Kidnapping was no longer enough. He wanted Lincoln dead. On April 14, 1865, Booth learned that the president would be attending a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater that evening. Seeing an opportunity, Booth set his plan into motion. He and his co-conspirators planned to assassinate not just Lincoln, but also Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, in a coordinated effort to throw the Union government into chaos. The assassination at Ford's Theater that evening, Lincoln arrived at Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and their guests, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. They took their seats in the presidential box above the stage. Security was minimal. Lincoln had dismissed his usual bodyguard, and the only protection was a lone police officer, John Frederick Parker, who left his post at intermission to get a drink at a nearby tavern. Booth, a familiar face at the theater, had no trouble gaining access. He waited until the play reached its funniest moment, a point when the audience would be laughing loudly. Then, at around 10:15 p.m., he crept into the box, pulled out a .44 caliber Derringer pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president slumped forward. Mary screamed. Major Rathbone lunged at Booth, who slashed him with a knife before leaping over the balcony railing. As he landed on the stage, he reportedly shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," Latin for "thus always to tyrants." Despite breaking his leg in the fall, Booth managed to flee the theater, escaping into the night on horseback. The fight for Lincoln's life chaos erupted inside the theater. Doctors in the audience rushed to Lincoln's side, but it was immediately clear that the wound was fatal. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he was laid in a small bed, barely big enough for his tall frame. For the next 9 hours, Lincoln lay unconscious as government officials, doctors, and his devastated wife gathered around him. His breathing was labored and his pulse weakened. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his last breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, overcome with emotion, reportedly murmured, "Now he belongs to the ages." The manhunt for Booth and national mourning. Meanwhile, John Wilkes Booth was on the run. He fled south, hiding in the Maryland countryside with the help of Confederate sympathizers. The largest manhunt in U.S. history ensued, with Union soldiers scouring the countryside for the fugitive assassin. 12 days later, Booth was tracked down to a barn in Virginia. When he refused to surrender, soldiers set the barn on fire. As he tried to flee, he was shot and killed. The nation plunged into mourning. Lincoln's body was placed in a funeral train that traveled from Washington, D.C. to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, making stops in major cities where hundreds of thousands of mourners came to pay their respects. The grief was overwhelming. For many, Lincoln's death felt like the final tragedy in a war that had already taken so much. Yet, even in death, Lincoln's legacy endured. He had not only preserved the Union, but had fundamentally reshaped America, setting it on a course toward the abolition of slavery and a new national identity. Though he would not live to see Reconstruction unfold, his vision of a united nation, with malice toward none, with charity for all, would shape the country for generations to come. Abraham. Lincoln's legacy is one of the most revered and mythologized in American history. Over time, he has been elevated to near sainthood, portrayed as the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, and a paragon of honesty and leadership. Statues, monuments, and even his presence on the penny and the $5 bill reinforce his status as one of the greatest presidents. But how much of this image is accurate, and how much is the result of historical myth-making? To understand Lincoln's true legacy, we must separate fact from fiction and explore what we can still learn from him today. The shaping of Lincoln's image. Immediately after his death, Lincoln's legacy was shaped by those who wanted to cement him as a national hero. His assassination on Good Friday, April 14, 1865, only added to the perception that he was a martyr, a leader who had died for the sins of the nation. Many newspapers and political figures compared him to Jesus Christ, reinforcing the idea that Lincoln had sacrificed himself to save the Union. In the years following his death, Lincoln's image was carefully crafted by biographers and historians, who sought to highlight his virtues while downplaying his more controversial actions. His secretary, John Hay, and his law partner, William Herndon, were among the first to publish accounts of his life, painting a picture of an almost superhuman leader. Over time, he was given the nickname Honest Abe, emphasizing his integrity, and the Great Emancipator, solidifying his role as the man who freed the slaves. The Lincoln Memorial, dedicated in 1922, further enshrined him as a symbol of unity and democracy. His Gettysburg Address was elevated to near scriptural status, and his face was etched into Mount Rushmore alongside Washington, Jefferson, and Roosevelt. But while Lincoln was undoubtedly a remarkable leader, the reality of his presidency was far more complex than the saintly image that has endured. Lincoln's policies versus modern perceptions. Lincoln is most famously remembered for abolishing slavery, but the reality is that his stance on slavery evolved over time. At the start of his political career, he was not an outright abolitionist. He opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories, but did not initially call for its immediate abolition where it already existed. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, is often cited as the moment Lincoln freed the slaves. However, it was more of a strategic wartime measure than an outright moral decree. It only applied to Confederate-held territories, meaning that slavery remained legal in border states that had remained loyal to the Union. Furthermore, Lincoln had previously supported the idea of colonization, relocating freed Black Americans to places like Liberia or Central America, believing that racial integration in the U.S. would be difficult. Over time, his views shifted. By the end of the war, he advocated for the passage of the 13th Amendment, which permanently abolished slavery, and even suggested that some Black men should be granted the right to vote, a radical stance at the time. Another myth is that Lincoln was universally beloved during his presidency. In reality, he was deeply polarizing. Many Northerners saw him as too hesitant on emancipation, while Southerners viewed him as a tyrant. His use of executive power was unprecedented. He suspended habeas corpus, shut down opposition newspapers, and expanded presidential authority in ways that many critics saw as unconstitutional. Had he lived beyond the war, it is likely that his Reconstruction policies would have faced significant resistance from Congress and the public. What we can learn from Lincoln today. Despite the myths and contradictions surrounding Lincoln, his legacy still holds valuable lessons. The power of growth and adaptation. One of Lincoln's greatest strengths was his ability to evolve. He was not a rigid ideologue, but a leader who listened, learned, and adjusted his beliefs as the situation required. His willingness to change, whether on slavery, civil rights, or military strategy, demonstrates the importance of adaptability in leadership. Leading through crisis. Lincoln's presidency was marked by extraordinary challenges, from secession to war to deep national division. Yet he maintained his composure, used humor to cope with stress, and made difficult decisions without allowing personal doubts to paralyze him. His ability to unify and inspire people in times of crisis remains a model for modern leaders. The importance of reconciliation. After the Civil War, Lincoln sought to heal the country rather than punish the South. His call for malice toward none, with charity for all, was a radical approach at a time when many wanted revenge. Though his vision for Reconstruction was cut short by his assassination, it remains a powerful reminder that healing after conflict is just as important as victory. The danger of myth-making. While it is natural to admire great leaders, it is also crucial to recognize their flaws. Lincoln's story reminds us that history is not black and white. Leaders are shaped by their times, make compromises, and are often more complex than their popular image suggests. Understanding history in its full depth allows us to learn from both the strengths and mistakes of those who came before us. The enduring legacy. Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most studied and celebrated figures in American history. His leadership preserved the United States, ended slavery, and set the stage for future civil rights progress. Yet, he was also a man of contradictions, both a moral visionary and a pragmatic politician, both revered and reviled in his time. By looking beyond the myths, we gain a richer understanding of who Lincoln truly was. Not a saint, but a man who faced extraordinary challenges and rose to meet them. And perhaps that is what makes his legacy even more powerful. Not that he was perfect, but that he was human. As we've explored, Abraham Lincoln was a leader of incredible complexity. Neither the flawless hero of legend nor the tyrant his enemies portrayed. His presidency was filled with difficult decisions, evolving beliefs, and the immense challenge of holding a fractured nation together. But what do you think? Was Lincoln truly the leader America needed at the time? Or has history smoothed over his flaws to create a mythic figure? Do we judge him too harshly or not harshly enough? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear different perspectives on Lincoln's leadership, legacy, and how his story still resonates today. If you found this deep dive interesting, check out my other videos on the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, and the hidden stories from Lincoln's time that history books often overlook. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any upcoming historical deep dives. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.